Hi everyone, welcome to week 8, the last week before a very well-deserved break. So, this week we're going to continue talking about cultural adaptation based, largely on archaeological finds and but also stuff that affects the current day. So we're starting to make that kind of transition from past to present in a cultural way. We kind of did that for biological adaptations when we looked at how biological anthropology helps understand human variation today along physical lines, biological lines, and now we're kind of doing a similar thing but with cultural adaptations. And after the break, we're going to be focusing more on contemporary societies. All right. So last week we were focusing on chapter 8, but there's a little bit in there that I had said you can skip over this. So pages 165 to 167 on subsistence strategies. It's fine if you read it last week, but we're going to be talking about it this week. Yay! And a big chunk of chapter 9. So if, ideally you look at this first, and so you can kind of use what's in these slides to help guide you through the relevant chunks of chapter 9. There's a bunch of it that we're skipping over. Again, we can't cover everything in this course, especially since we're not seeing each other face to face. So a big chunk of chapter 9 is in here, but if you use this as a guideline, it'll kind of help guide you. And as usual, I throw in some extra stuff as well, because that's how I roll. So this is a return slide from last week, just to kind of remind us of what's the main idea here. We talked about cultural adaptation when we were talking about archaeology and how archaeologists, look at material remains from the past to try to figure out how people lived, what were their cultures like. So it's not so much about the stuff, but how the stuff is related to cultural adaptation. And just to remind you, what does that mean exactly? Cultural adaptation, we're talking about ways in which humans find ways to survive in specific environments. So we talked extensively about biological adaptation and how that leads to evolution over time, not just among humans, but all living species. And now we're focusing on cultural adaptation, which again, we've talked about before because we're using a biocultural approach, and we saw how with ancient hominins some cultural develops wound up affecting their biological evolution, right? So they're not disconnected things, just to remind people of that. But now we're definitely kind of veering more towards the cultural side of things. So these ways of surviving include knowledge, right? You have to know your environment, skills, how to do things, different activities, often involving getting the things that you need to survive, technologies, so what do you use to do these things, and also to remind you that the environment offers possibilities and limitations, but it doesn't necessarily determine culture. And they talk a little bit about this at the beginning of chapter 9 in the textbook as well, where, sometimes you'll see people have a similar way of doing things, but in different parts of the world and with, different environments. And sometimes you'll have different cultural groups existing in a similar environment, but doing things different ways. Okay, so possibilities and limitations, but not kind of this strict correlation. And also, when we talk about cultural evolution, we're talking about changes in cultural patterns over time. We're not talking about things getting better necessarily, all right? It's not the same thing as progress. And this week, it's crucial to remember that, because we're going to talk about how in some parts of the world there was a shift from, say, gathering wild plants, fishing, and hunting wild animals to food production involving cultivation, domestication of plants and animals. And sometimes, in popular thinking, sometimes people equate this with progress. Oh, things got better with agriculture, and people who practice agriculture are more advanced than people who don't, and that's dangerous thinking because it reeks of ethnocentrism, and that can also lead to racism in some cases. So yeah, we'll talk about that a bit more, but I do want to re-emphasize that it's super important. Every way of living, every subsistence pattern, subsistence strategy is adaptive in some places, and the reason why agriculture has, and we'll talk about this again, but agriculture has kind of, taken over in the world, and you don't have a lot of populations left that practice other ways of doing things. A lot of that has to do with colonization and imperialism. Okay, so it's not, it's that's another reason why it's important to not assume that cultural changes always have to do with progress. Sometimes people have actually been harmed by being forced to start farming when they were living perfectly well by gathering and hunting. Okay, so keep that in mind. So what are subsistence strategies? This is from chapter 8 and these pages here. Subsistence, the word is subsistence itself in anthropology, we use it in a way that means satisfying our kind of basic survival needs. So, food, shelter, clothing, right? We could probably add the equipment and technology needed to do those things as well, right? Water, right? Some here it seems to be included under food, but subsistence strategies then are the ways in which we do this. How do we these survival needs? And in that section of the textbook, you have this division between food collectors and food producers. This is a very typical distinction. You'll have different textbooks in anthropology phrase this slightly differently. Sometimes you'll see the word foraging. They listed in our textbook too, so they'll refer to food collectors as foragers. This is not derogatory, it's just foraging just simply means collecting food. And when we're talking about food collecting or foraging, we're talking about we're not domesticating anything, right? These are wild fish, plants, animals that get collected. And sometimes students, later on they'll write a paper and they're talking about a society where there's gathering of wild plants and refer to it as cultivation. No, cultivation, we'll talk about that more, is only when you're intentionally planting things. Okay, if you're gathering wild plants that grow, that's not cultivation. Okay, that doesn't, again, I'll say this again, I really feel strongly about emphasizing this because sometimes people will see food collecting as somehow primitive. It's not. You need a lot of knowledge to do this, right? And food collectors, and we'll see this again, traditionally have had access to a very wide array of wild plants, sometimes plants that look a lot alike, but some of them are toxic and some of them are not, and you need to know all of them. So there's a lot of knowledge and wisdom involved in this way of living. It is not primitive at all. Just because there are fewer tools involved, it doesn't mean it's primitive. Food production, on the other hand, food producers are peoples who practice domestication of plants, animals, or both, and we're going to talk extensively about domestication and what that means, all right? But examples of this include herding animals, not herding like H-U-R-T, although they can get hurt in the process sometimes, but herding H-E-R-D, all right? So moving herds of animals around, and different kinds of farming. And there's a nice little chart that sums it up. This is from the textbook, page 166. So you have subsistence strategies, and then you have food collectors here and food producers here. And I put rough categories because these are categories kind of created by anthropologists to kind of put similar things together. But there are places in the world where people might practice more than one thing side by side, or sometimes you have things that kind of fall between the cracks of these categories. So it's like with anything else we talk about, these are kind of ways to help us understand variation, in this case cultural variation, but it's not, there's sometimes ambiguity there. So as you see, food collectors, what I like about this textbook is that they do distinguish, and they don't, in past textbooks I've read, they just lump all food collectors together as though they all did the same thing, and actually they're different, and we could add more. I mean, there are different techniques involved in hunting in different parts of the world, where sometimes people will hunt in groups with nets, and there are different things involved there. And food producers, so with food producing, we talked about herding just before, distinguishing it from hurting, right? But a lot of the talk this week concerns things around agriculture, okay? And so we'll talk about that a little bit more here, but I'm going to again come back to this here. So food collection is the oldest subsistence strategy. This existed before anything else among humans. But again, I know I'm a pain, but this is so important to me because I'm very tightly connected to some people who, you know, are from cultures where this is, you know, people were practicing this way of living up until a century ago full time, and even 50 years ago we're still doing this for a big part of the year, and it's very meaningful for them. And the wisdom involved is phenomenal. So not less evolved at all. As I mentioned, requires in-depth knowledge of the environment. And yeah, some populations in the world practice this exclusively until, you know, the mid-1900s. And some indigenous populations whose ancestors relied on food collection still value this way of life, and as much as they can practice it today. So if you go up to northern Quebec, and I don't mean the Laurentians or Mont Tremblant, I mean the real north. Okay, that's something that always bugs me. Like real north, like drive 16 hours or take a plane and go all the way up. You know, you'll meet people who really, you know, hunting, for example, is still something that's highly valued, not as a sport, but because people have very deep connection with the land and with all the other living things that live on it. And just because they hunt animals, you know, when it's not for sport, when it's for survival, people respect the animals that they hunt, and there's a lot of ritual protocol around that. And also ethics, such as not taking more than you need. Okay, so most textbooks don't do a very good job of portraying the richness of cultures that have traditionally relied on food collection. And that it irritates me. It really irritates me because anthropologists should know better. Anyways, end rant. So food production. So food production emerged meaning you're producing food, you're not just collecting wild things, and I shouldn't even use the word just there because that kind of contradicts what I just ranted about, but you're undergoing different processes that involve manipulating your environment in some way. So emerged around 10,000 years ago. KYA is an abbreviation for 1,000 years ago, just so you know, just like MYA is a million years ago. And it happened in different places in the world independently. Okay, so it's not something that emerged in one part of the world and then spread out. It kind of popped up in different parts of the world roughly in the same period. So there's a whole section in the textbook where they go over older theories about why that is, and there have been some archaeologists who've proposed these kind of universal theories for why it happened everywhere, not everywhere, but in all these different locations at the same time. And, you know, they had different theories that involved, you know, kind of shifts in diet and you know, environmental changes and population changes. And so there have been different debates around that. More recently, though, archaeologists tend to go with what the textbook authors refer to as multi-strand theories. So acknowledging, again, that we live on a very diverse planet in terms of environments, climates, the movement of populations, and so on and so forth, so that all the places in which food production emerged around that time, which is a wicked long time ago, happened for different combinations of reasons. So the climate was involved, the physical environment, demographics, so things like population size and population movements, technological factors, social causes. So each place had its own kind of combination of things going on that would have contributed to the emergence of food production. And it wasn't, I don't mention this here, but it's, and the textbook mentions this a couple of times, it wasn't always like a shift, like, okay, we're giving up gathering wild plants and hunting, and we're going to do this from now on, like this overnight thing. Like with biological adaptations and evolution, things happen over time. So there were transition periods, and there were places where people intentionally kept two ways of doing things, because you can plant things but still go hunting, for example. So locally, the nations that are a part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, such as the Kanien'kehá:ka, more commonly known as Mohawk. Haudenosaunee is the proper word for what you learned in high school as Iroquois. Iroquois was not their word. But yeah, I mean, we're talking about agricultural cultures here, but hunting still happens even today. All right, so it's kind of, things can exist side by side. It's not, that's why I was saying before, these are rough categories. They're not, there are things sometimes that coexist. So food production, why we're talking about it a lot and why the textbook devotes practically a whole chapter to it, it's had lasting impacts on the world. And that, we'll talk more about those impacts in terms of, population growth, and in later, I was going to say in later semesters, later weeks. I need a break too. In later weeks, we'll talk more about, how that's linked with population growth and what that implies for hierarchies and economic relations and populations and everything else about culture. Because it's all connected. Remember that holistic perspective that we talked about weeks 1 and 2? That's going to come back and haunt us in a very real way. But partly also is, the contribution to larger populations, so which I just mentioned, which would go on to colonize other places. So as I mentioned before, there are lots of places in the world where folks were living quite well off of food collecting, subsistence strategies. And then sometimes people were kind of forced by colonizers to adopt farming instead because it was more beneficial to the people who were taking over. So that's really important to remember too. And they don't really talk about it in the textbook, but I learned a lot about the impacts of colonization, and that's something that we can see when we look at that literature and listen to what indigenous people have to say. Now, not all indigenous people, traditionally practiced food collecting, right? There's a wide variety, but those, again, like we talk of people just kind of indigenous populations just north of Montreal, the Anishinaabe peoples, the Iu or Cree peoples, Inuit. These are folks who up until, a century ago relied largely on food collecting and have been forced by colonization to switch or rely on store-bought food and stuff like that. So now we're going to get into the mechanics of it a little bit, right? It's not hands-on. If we were in person, maybe we could talk to the folks who work in the Vanier Gardens, but we're not, so we're doing what we can. So domestication and cultivation are two words that come up and that people commonly confuse, and it's important to know what the difference is. So domestication really refers to how humans modify the descent of a plant or animal species. So when we're talking about domestication, it's important not to confuse this, for example, with having pets or houseplants, because sometimes especially if you speak French, you might hear, animal domestique used to mean pet. So that's one way, because pets tend to be animals that have been domesticated, but they don't mean the same thing. We're not talking about pets and houseplants here. So what this means, so you remember natural selection, right? And how nature selects certain physical traits that are adaptive in a certain environment, and of course the individuals that have these traits are more likely to live long enough to reproduce and pass on their genes, right? So this is something that happens in nature to all living species, from humans to our primate relatives, all the animals, all the plants, all the bacteria, the viruses, the talk of the town these days, viruses. So domestication is similar to that, except that instead of nature selecting characteristics based on adaptation to the environment, it's human desire. So what's useful, right? So when we talk about dogs, as you might know, are related to wolves. Wolves are wild. And dogs are the domesticated version, right? So at some point in time, and this happened in different places in the world, humans kind of selected some individuals in, the parent population and just kind of breeded them together, and over time this led to new species that was, more docile, that was more friendly to humans, and so on and so forth. All right, and this happened with other kinds of animals that you see on farms today, and of course, any plants that are grown through agriculture. So cultivation is not the same thing. They're connected, but cultivation first of all refers to plants. Domestication refers to plants and animals. All right, and when you cultivate, we're talking about a whole set of activities involved, and it also involves an interaction with the environment of a plant species. So, and I'm quoting here directly from the textbook: preparing fields, sowing, weeding, harvesting, and storing products, right? So that's why, again, sometimes students will talk about, they'll read an ethnography, for example, about a culture of foragers, and they'll talk about gathering plants, and they'll refer to it as cultivation. That's not cultivation. Cultivation is when you're intentionally planting things, and so you have to prepare the fields and do all these other things. It's a lot of work, actually. So it's important to kind of know the difference between the terms that we use. Vocabulary is important. If you're going to become scholars, using the right words makes a difference in how well you're understood. So that's why we're picky in terms of the right terminology. Okay, responding this, when I got the first assignment back, some people were, when they were looking back at their responses in the weekly quizzes, and they're looking at their own rationales, and I saw a lot of comments where people saying, well, my thing said pretty much the same thing as the expert rationale, but in less words, or without as many details, or without these long fancy words. And yeah, sometimes they're annoying words, but I mean, in the world, if you're going to be a scholar, using very specific terminology becomes important. And it's just like in what we call the hard sciences. If you're going into medical sciences, you need to use the right word. It's the same thing in social sciences. Okay, you want to make yourself understood, you have to be very specific with your words and use them the right way. Speaking of words, here's another one that can be confusing because sometimes things get lumped in together. But what is agriculture? So agriculture, does involve cultivation, but agriculture is wider than that, right? Because it's an entire system. It's an entire subsistence strategy. We already saw this term back on that chart with agriculture being underneath that category of food producers or food producing. So back in that section of chapter 8, they distinguish between different kinds of agriculture. And so they talk about extensive agriculture, which it's counterintuitive, but extensive agriculture is actually smaller scale than what they refer to as intensive. And the reason is that with extensive agriculture, and again, this is kind of a new term for me because in other textbooks they refer to it as horticulture. And I understand the problem with horticulture is that in popular language, horticulture means something different than here. So in anthropology, the way we use the term horticulture usually, or in the case of this textbook, extensive agriculture, is societies that are relatively small-sized populations, and they'll plant things. So they use cultivation. But instead of using, big plows and machinery and things like that, they're using simple tools, and they'll actually rotate their crops. So what that means is that, they might plant a certain crop in one part of their land for a while, for a few years, and as you might know, if you've had any experience farming yourself, or if you have friends who farmed, or if you've learned about this, you might know that after a while, if you keep using the same soil over and over again, and this is a case for house plants too, right? This is why we replant our plants, repot them, I should say, with new soil, is that it lacks, it loses its richness and its fertility, right? I don't know if fertility is the right word, but it's you need to change the soil. So in extensive agriculture or horticultural societies, they'll leave the soil in one part alone for a while. So they'll plant there for a few years and then move the crops somewhere else. Sometimes there's something that's done in some places called slash and burn, where they'll clear a new space by burning some of the brush or trees or plant life that's there, and then the ashes mix in with the soil and produce nice fertile soil. Okay, so these are kind of smaller populations, and they're relatively egalitarian. We're going to talk about egalitarianism more in a few weeks, but egalitarian societies, we contrast them to hierarchical societies where when there's a hierarchy, some people are considered more valuable, more important, as deserving more access to food and riches and power and things like that. But when you have an egalitarian society, nobody's worth more than others, and things are split up more evenly. And we'll talk about that more eventually, but we tend to see a lot of that in food collecting societies, because they're small as well. They need to keep their population small. And that's something that'll come back. And so egalitarianism is easier to maintain when you have a small population. Then, when you start to have intensive agriculture, oh, and by the way, the difference in terminology, so extensive means you're using wider plots of land because you're rotating your crops, right? With intensive agriculture, you can use the same plot of land over and over again because you irrigate it, you fertilize it, okay? I think that should be an I, fertilization. Whoops. Okay, I'll fix it later. So plows, work animals like oxes, things like that. So it's more intensive in one spot. Then that leads to larger populations, and you start to have hierarchies that emerge. And yet a third type of agriculture, so you have mechanized industrial agriculture, and which is what most of us are familiar with, kind of these very large scale industrial factory style farms, right? So with these first two types, extensive and intensive agriculture, we're talking about populations that subsist on this directly. So everybody in the family is involved in working the land, for example. There's division of labor, especially with intensive agriculture. Okay, so, and as we'll see later, not everybody does everything, but we're still talking about populations where you have more people involved in the work itself. When you get to intensive agriculture, that's eventually, if you read up on that, and they talk a bit about this in chapter 9, where, some people would kind of start to form cities, then obviously the people living in the cities were involved in other kinds of things and relying on food that was brought in from, markets from outside the city, right? So, of course, not everybody was involved in agriculture in these settings, all right? But you do have societies in the world where pretty much everybody's working the farm. Where then, where you have mechanized industrial agriculture, well then, it's only certain people who own farms and work on them, and the rest of us kind of do other things and buy our food in stores, right? So we're not involved at all with the actual modes of production. So agriculture and sedentism, so this is another kind of connection that we can look at, and the textbook looks at this a bit. Sedentism means humans settling in one place, right? And that's different from nomadism, with humans moving throughout a territory on a seasonal basis. Actually, not only humans do this. So, but there's some misconceptions about the distinction between these two, okay? So some people mistakenly think that nomadism is aimless and unending wandering forever and ever, and no, that's not the case. As I've mentioned this earlier today in my little rants, nomadism requires intimate knowledge of the land, and it's not unending wandering, right? It's throughout a territory on a seasonal basis. So people, again, like if we think about indigenous folks in northern Quebec, people have traditionally been nomadic, but they would circulate within a certain territory. So they would have camps that they would go through in the winter. Sometimes they might move because they knew where the animals were going to be moving around. So they're kind of following the source of their food. And then sometimes in the summers they would all gather together in bigger, community style, gatherings, right? So it's not, they wouldn't just kind of wander forever and ever and ever, right? It was just kind of a seasonal, migration in a territory. Sedentism isn't, so there's another misconception, and I've been guilty of this one too, that sedentism is impossible among food collectors. Not necessarily, all right? It tends to go well with, nomadism tends to go well with food collecting because you're really following the food on a seasonal basis. So where do the wild plants grow in different seasons? But it has happened in the world where there are some situations where there's such an abundance of wild plants and animals in an area throughout the year that people have been able to settle. And the textbook gives the example of the west coast of Canada with some of the indigenous, some of the First Nations, specifically populations in that area, who were kind of able to settle, and there was always so much fish and certain kind of plants and animals around that they can kind of be settled in one place and still take advantage of all the wild plants and animals around them and not have to cultivate necessarily. More misconceptions. Okay, because it's important to address them, because if we just talk about the concepts and the misconceptions don't get addressed, sometimes people just stay with the misconceptions and that overrides the new things that are trying to come in. All right. And this one I kind of ranted about before, right? So there's a misconception that food production is more advanced than food collection. And no, they're adaptive in different circumstances, okay? So one is not more advanced than the others. Food production, cultures relying on food production might be more complex, and the textbook talks a lot about complexity, and that's going to come back. But complex doesn't mean better or more advanced, and it doesn't mean that people's minds are more complex, right? It just means there are more steps to everything and more layers to everything. So, whoops, duplicate slide, and here's another part of it. So agriculture was more so we're still talking about misconceptions, and there's this popular thinking that agriculture was really more beneficial to humans than gathering and hunting, and that this is what saved humanity. And, well, actually, there are advantages to agriculture, but there are also disadvantages. And that's the case for all subsistence strategies, right? There are pros and cons to everything, and that's why when in the places where the domestication of plants and animals emerged with cultivation and agriculture, there were some advantages that were perceived. It seemed like a good idea at the time, and people don't know what's going to happen in 10 years, 100 years, 500 years, or 1,000 years, so they couldn't necessarily see what some of the disadvantages were going to be down the line. And also those disadvantages affected some people more than others, and that's still the case today. So let's look at some of the pros and cons. So advantages of agriculture, and these are the ones that people tend to talk about. Larger food supply. So for sure, in this, in a smaller space, you can kind of grow a lot more food than you'll obtain through collecting food, right? And that's why food collectors tend, and again, we saw there are exceptions to this, but food collectors have tended to be nomadic because they would circulate in a much larger territory throughout the year without this need for permanent settlements, right? So they'd be going where the food was, and whereas agriculture, you stay put, and just in that area where you are, you can get more food from that area. More reliable, more stable food supply, and I put sort of because we're going to see that it's not always the case. But the idea is that you don't have to go around chasing your food. Migratory animals can change their patterns sometimes, and if you're producing your own food, it's right there, and you have kind of more control over it, and so therefore there's kind of more reliability and stability involved. The idea is that you always have food coming in. Okay, so those are kind of some of the perceived advantages of agriculture. And what goes with that is that you can support a larger population, and this has indeed been connected with larger populations. And the part of the chapter we're not covering right now talks about, the rise of cities eventually and things like that. So those are some things that are seen as positive by a lot of people. Also, some things that are linked with this are task specialization. And I'm not listing those as advantages, because they're not necessarily advantages. It really depends on different points of view here, and whether you're talking about, are they advantageous to just the people who wound up being wealthier? Right, and a lot of the other advantages that are talked about are actually only advantageous for people who had access to those advantages. So when you talk about, for example, task specialization, so the idea is that, okay, not everybody has to be working in the field. Some people can go on to be artists or lawyers or things like that, not everybody has, even today, access to those opportunities, right? So there's still some people who are stuck schlepping and working in shit jobs, whether they're agricultural or not, and others who have access to more, to work that feels more fulfilling for them, let's say. These more stable and more reliable food supplies wound up being distributed in uneven ways. So with agriculture also came poverty. So yeah, more food, but more food for some people. So that's something the textbook doesn't really talk about. They talk about it a little bit, and it'll come back when we talk about economic relations. So that said, let's look at some of the disadvantages of agriculture that, of course, at the time, it's not like people were weighing the pros and cons. It seemed like a good idea at the time. And people started with smaller scale planting and agriculture, right? There wasn't this shift anywhere from kind of nomadic hunting and gathering to big farms overnight. These are all changes that happened over generations, and when shifts did happen, they started with very small scale planting, probably of the kind of horticultural type where you move your plot, your plots, your crops around, and then in some places later on that wound up being larger scale. So what are some disadvantages, again, over time, or even immediately? There's actually archaeological evidence that early agricultural peoples weren't as healthy, actually. They can see this in their teeth and other fossilized parts of their bodies, because actually with agriculture, you're actually losing variety. And there have been studies where, contemporary or recent food collectors who relied on wild plants had hundreds of plant species that they could eat. Whereas with agriculture, you actually have fewer varieties, and it's less nutritious. So you're seeing more problems in people's teeth. People were shorter. All right, so that's one disadvantage, but that's not something they would have known right away. There are actually more disease and pests. So the conditions of agriculture and how that modifies the environment, you have things like stagnant water, some of the storage sometimes attracts pests, you have more crowded populations, and then when you have more people gathered together, you're like, how do you dispose of your human waste? Things haven't always been the way that they are today. So, and even the way things are today can lead to unsanitary conditions in some places, but that's not something, again, people who are wealthier don't experience that. It's far from them. But yeah, more crowded conditions, diseases spread more easily. If an area gets kind of corrupted with a lot of pests, well, food collectors, they could walk away from that, right? They're not stuck there. When you have settled populations, they're stuck there. So you had diseases like tuberculosis, which would spread like wildfire. It's actually more work. So sometimes there's this, I could have put this under misconceptions, but there's this misconception that, hunting and gathering are so hard and people are working constantly and they're starving half the time. And for sure there are famines sometimes. That happens because if an animal population goes down because of climatic conditions, then humans are going to respond to that. But that's the same thing for crops as well. There can be a disaster that kind of wipes out a bunch of crops. That's something I should have put in there as well, as more vulnerability to natural disasters. So, but yeah, it's more work. You have to clear the land, you have to plant, you have to take care of the plants, harvest, process, store the food, and take care of animals if there's also animals involved in this farm life. Any of you, if you visited a farm or if you have relatives who are farmers, they get up very early, and this is 365 days a year, right? Because the plants don't take vacations, neither do the animals, so it's kind of constant, all right? Whereas food collectors actually, recent and contemporary food collectors, there have been studies that show that they had more free time than people, say, living in mainstream North America. Okay, so mainstream North America, you have these, houses, these homes, you have to clean, you have to dust, you have to clean your floors, you have to do dishes, you have to do all this stuff. It's not a lot of free time, whereas food collectors, sometimes they would put in a lot of intense hours, but they would be strategic about what time of day, maybe not when it's too hot, or, what are the animals doing right now, what's the best strategy. But they had a lot of free time where they could, participate in ritual activities or social activities. And the work that is done in these societies, and small-scale agriculture societies as well, is largely social, right? So there's that. So more work, and that work wasn't divided evenly, right? So especially as you got larger and larger population, you started to have that division of labor that was uneven. So some people are stuck literally doing, the schlep work, whereas other people could distance themselves from that. And so you have a rise of social inequality along the lines of wealth. Property ownership also comes with this, because for food collectors, there's no kind of private property. There are territorial boundaries that are in effect, but it's not the same thing as owning a plot of land. It's having rights to it and having a relationship to it. So there's that. So the rise of social inequality that goes with the work being divided unevenly, and also, as we'll talk about in a future week, the products being divided unequally, with some people seen as deserving more of them than others. And something it's not really mentioned in here. They kind of frame as a positive thing. Earlier on in the chapter, they talk about the increase of fertility for women, and how they could, have more babies, and they frame that as positive. But the impact on women in these kind of social transitions and cultural transitions was actually that often there would be more pressure to produce more babies, because farm life can support more people, but you also need more people to do the work. So gender equality kind of came with this as well, because among food collectors, women are autonomous, they have their work, and they're considered valuable and important, and they have a say on the activities of their group. And in small-scale farming societies, you see that too. The local Ganyenkehaga I mentioned earlier, women had very prominent roles as clan mothers, for example, and village chiefs would be answerable to them. And but larger scale agriculture, you have to start to have a lot of pressure on women having more babies, which is not always good for the women's bodies or their morale, and they're kind of stuck at home doing more domestic stuff or doing stuff close to the home. So, and being less involved in political decisions that affect their communities. So all these disparities kind of came with agriculture. There's a scholar named Jared Diamond who once wrote an article that claimed that agriculture was the worst mistake of humankind because of these and other reasons. So that, I'm not saying that agriculture is necessarily bad, because there are societies who've managed to kind of still be relatively equal in their society and practice some form of agriculture. So it doesn't have to be this way, but we have seen that it largely does wind up being this way, and it's still the case today. So again, these are all things that'll come back, because we're going to talk about all these issues separately: gender, economic relations, stratification, social inequality. These things are all going to come back. So this is a bit of a preview, as well as kind of a wrap up to our first half of the semester of kind of looking at evolution and how things changed over time. I just wanted to leave you with this, that we've been talking about food and survival in a very kind of survival-based way, but when we're in class, I usually like to have these discussions where, food goes beyond just survival. There are cultural meanings behind food, and that people in different cultures, there's always some kind of thing that goes behind sharing a meal, and and if you have time, I would encourage you, usually we have an activity with this, but you can look at some of these videos and texts here that talk about the local Haudenosaunee, like I said, which is their own word for Iroquois. And there are 6 nations as a part of this confederacy, and kind of their stories and ideas about giving thanks to sources of food, and so it goes beyond this survival thing. So you can kind of have a look at some of these things. It's good to kind of know what's been going on for millennia in the place where you live, and these are just things to think about. And obviously we're not in class, so we can't have these discussions. The pandemic will end someday. That's what I keep telling myself. So, as usual, if you have any questions, let me know, and have a fantastic break.